wanted to talk about some story, because that's the one thing I think the show lacks the most for me is the paranormal aspect. We do a lot of conspiracy stuff, and then a medium amount of paranormal and very little true crime, and I'm kind of fine with that, but I'd like to bump up the ghost stories just a little bit. The problem is that a lot of times I've become, in my age, a little more skeptical of ghost stories. I think they're really fun and they spook me out, and I love talking about them. But I can't help sometimes accidentally, disproving them. Now, not all the time, but that's one of the reasons why I'll look up a ghost story and I'm like, oh, that's really cool. And then I look at it a little bit more and I'm like, damn it, it's totally not true. And this is why it's not true. So, for this episode, I want to look at one of my favorite ghost stories that I'd heard over the years. And it is it's Flight 401. So, some quick background to this. This was a real event. Flight 401 was an airplane. It was, well, obviously, but I mean, it was I think it was like a lock jet? Is that even a thing? Okay, so back in the year 1972, there was a Lockheed aircraft that was flying a bunch of people. It had 163 people on it and the crew. And they're flying, and they're going to land in Florida. Now, what happened was they went to switch on their landing gear, and there's this little light that's supposed to come on to say that the landing gear is locked and ready for use. And the light didn't come on. And it's nighttime, and the guys are like, hey, we can't really get a visual on whether or not this is down yet. And they're fiddling with it. And they call ahead to the air traffic control, and they said, hey, we're going to circle around a bit and try to figure out what's going on with their landing gear. And air traffic control goes, okay, hit 2,000 feet, circle around the Everglades. So they took apart the assembly, and they're looking at the light to figure out why it's not on. They send a guy down into the cone, because they do have down there a way to visually look out to see if the landing gear is down. And at one point, the captain's like, hey, put on the autopilot while we're doing this. So they clip on the autopilot, and something goes wrong. Either the autopilot gets knocked off accidentally or shuts itself off, some sort of glitch. But the plane drops a little bit in elevation and then slowly begins to glide down into the dark swamp. And it's happening so slowly, the pilots don't realize that the plane's descending. And eventually, it just crashes into the Everglades, into the swamp. The pilots and the flight engineer, they died. 2 of the 10 flight attendants died, and 96 of the 163 passengers died. Some of them died on impact, and some of them died because they're just bleeding out. They took them to the hospital and there's nothing they could do for them. What happened was they took pieces out of this Flight 401, and they didn't have a lot of Lockheed jets back then. This was kind of a newer jet. So they began putting the pieces into other Lockheeds that were in service. I had always heard this story as one of the most verifiable ghost encounters, because basically the story went that every plane that had a piece of Flight 401 in it experienced ghostly sightings. One of the most notable ones was there was a plane, I believe it was going to Mexico City, and this woman was this flight attendant. She wasn't just a woman, but she's a flight attendant. She notices something out of the corner of her eye, and she looks in the oven because she saw something there, and she saw the face of a man staring at her from inside the oven. And it totally freaked her out, but I don't know if the man said it while he was in the oven or then popped out of the oven. But anyways, it was the ghost of Don Repo, who was one of the flight engineers on Flight 401. He said there's going to be a fire on this plane. And as that plane was descending into Mexico City, one of the engines burned out, caught on fire. And supposedly the ghost of Don Repo then went, or the captain, one of the 2 ghosts, went into the cabin and talked the pilots down so they could land the plane. Extraordinary story. These other planes that had these pieces also had sightings of it, including like the vice president of Eastern Airlines, which is the company that ran the jet and the fleet of jets that had these parts. He said that he saw the ghost of Tom Loft, who was the captain. Stewardesses said that they saw ghosts. Passengers said that they'd be sitting in their chair and they'd look over and there'd be a person in an aviation uniform. Is that the right word? A captain uniform, I guess. Sitting next to him, and they'd be like, oh, hey, I didn't see you there. And then they would disappear, and like other people on the plane would be like, oh my God, totally disappeared. And so the conspiracy was that Eastern Airlines, like in any flight where they recorded in their logbook, I saw a ghost, Eastern Airlines removed the logbook and replaced it with a new one. And the flight where the captain was in the cockpit talking the other pilots down, the voice recorder for that disappeared. So Eastern Airlines was making a concerted effort to shut down this investigation. All of this came out when an author wrote a nonfiction book called The Ghost of Flight 401, and his name was Fuller, John G. Fuller. So he writes this book, and it became very popular. They made several movies about it, and it's been considered one of those cases that could have been the most, concrete way to prove the existence of ghosts, but Eastern Airlines, they took all the parts out of all the plane, they cannibalized Flight 401 and put the parts in these other planes, and that's where the ghosts were showing up. Well, they took all the parts out and got rid of them because they were tired of the ghost stories. And so we were no longer able to verify this. Now, I remember reading about that story a long time ago, and honestly, I probably saw or at least heard of the movie as a child, because it's an older movie. And it's kind of creepy, because you're already on an airplane, you're already fairly trapped. And I was like, this would be a good, Halloween story. And so I started looking into it. I had a basic memory of it, and then I had to kind of, track it down and stuff like that. And there's been a lot of pushback on it in recent years, that it's absolutely 100% fake. 100% fake. And the pushback is that there was another author who wrote a book about the history of Eastern Airlines. And Eastern Airlines, at the time, they were so incensed the fact that this author was saying that there was a conspiracy to hush up ghosts, that they were going to sue him. They were actually going to sue him for defamation, because they said it's completely foolish to think that, one, we would care about ghosts at all, and then two, basically punish our employees for believing in ghosts. The Eastern Airlines launched their own internal investigation and began talking to people, and everyone's like, I never saw a ghost. In the book, The Ghost of Flight 401, all the names are changed, so you can't track down the initial people he talked to. But Eastern Airlines talked to pilots and all that stuff, and they're like, no, I never saw a ghost. I read the book too, I heard about it, it's totally nonsense. The wife of Captain Loft, she tried suing Fuller for invasion of privacy and things like that, and that case got dismissed, not because it turns out the book was true, but because invasion of privacy really only works if the person's not a public figure, and you could argue that Tom Loft was a public figure. He was very well known, he was part of this accident. And so I'm reading all this stuff, and I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe Eastern Airlines is just kind of covering, maybe they did cover it up, and now they have to cover their tracks, so they covered it up. And so I'm doing this research, and I was already kind of I was like, oh man, this was a story that I always liked, and there's some pretty interesting pushback to it. But then I was reading another website, and it put the nail in the coffin. They said there were no pieces salvaged from Flight 401. None. The plane on impact just got shredded. And this website I was on, it was called Skeptoid, because I'll look at the skeptical websites. They really pop up at the top of the searches a lot of times. But I was going to tell the story initially, and then once I found out that there was some controversy about it, I was like, well, let's see what the other site says. And they had an interesting point. They said, one, that's not common for items that suffer like a plane that suffers massive damage, for anything to be salvageable out of it. And they said, secondly, least of all, an oven. Ovens are fairly fragile things. So you're telling me that this plane crash that killed over 100 people, or around 100 people, but the oven survived so perfectly, you could take it out of that plane and then put it in another plane, and it would still cook. It would still be operational. And I was like, yeah, I guess that makes sense. So, I mean, I'm leaning more. I think that it's an interesting, and again, the thing that trips you up with this stuff, and me especially, is if the story is intriguing, it's more believable. And it really shouldn't be that way, but it is. If I had to bet money right now, if there were ghosts from Flight 401, if that really happened on other planes, I would say no, I don't think it happened. But I still think it's an intriguing story. And I would have... Well, actually, here's my question. If the ghost was on a plane, wouldn't, if the plane take off, the ghosts fall out of the plane? I still don't understand ghost physics. Do the ghosts suffer inertia? If... You know how, you're on a plane and you kind of stumble sometimes and it does something with the goat? Would that happen to a ghost? I don't know. Still a creepy story, but I was a little disappointed because I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to talk about that on my show. But again, I like to present both sides, so there we go. That was a clip from our daily podcast, Dead Rabbit Radio. Dead Rabbit Radio is available anywhere that you listen to podcasts. It's daily paranormal, conspiracy, and true crime news. If you want to hear the full episode that this clip came from, check the link below. Please like and subscribe. And hit that little bell, too. That does some magical stuff. Thanks, guys.